If you do not mind, then appreciate my efforts by subscribing to my channel. Thank you very much in advance.
Welcome to Special News YouTube channel. Russia's war in Ukraine is becoming a complete mess and a dead end for Russia. While the war pushes the whole Europe to make radical changes in military, diplomatic, political and socioeconomic fields, Russia is dragging itself to the bottom with the wrong decisions it made in these areas, the desire to continue the war unnecessarily, and the sanctions of the West. To compensate for the losses of the Ukraine-Russian war, Vladimir Putin surprised all the Russian people by declaring mobilization across the country at the end of September. The Russian army entered Ukraine with nearly 200,000 soldiers at the end of February to invade, but at the end of 9 months, the Russian army's manpower and military equipment were at the point of exhaustion. Around 150,000 dead and wounded soldiers from the Russian army were eliminated by the Ukrainian armed forces. After Vladimir Putin announced his decision to mobilize, aiming to recruit 300,000 volunteers from among Russian citizens to replace this huge loss in the Russian army, everything turned upside down in Russia. All Russian cities, including Moscow, started to burn Vladimir Putin in the fire that broke out after this decision. In Russia, the streets are boiling like a witch's cauldron, with riots, clashes, violations of the Russian police, those trying to escape from Russia, and even angry Russian civilians shooting Russian commanders, or angry Russians setting fire to Russian military centers with Molotov cocktails. On the same day as the mobilization decision announced by leader Vladimir Putin on Russian state television, Russian citizens began to leave the country. Russian local people who could not even get over the shock of the incident flocked to plane tickets. When the Russian administration could not see the reaction it was targeting, it secretly changed the criteria for military service. Across Russia, many Russian citizens were recruited into the army whether or not they met the criteria set by the Russian Defense Ministry. Soldiers of the Russian Guard Regiment had toured all the universities in Russia in the early hours of the morning to procure the targeted 300,000 volunteers. The mobilization decision was met with a very harsh reaction by the Russian people. Protests by Russian citizens, actions against the war and forced mobilization echoed in Russian streets for days. Every Russian citizen who took the anti-Putin and anti-war banner threw himself on the street and made an effort to put an end to this order. The harshest and most striking reaction against mobilization in the Russian Federation occurred in the town of Ust-Ilimsk in the Irkutsk region. As a result of this anger at the mobilization decision announced by Putin, an armed person started shooting bullets at the Russian military office in the region. The gunman vomited his anger against the mobilization with the words, "No one will fight and now we are all going home." After entering the military office, the person who rained bullets with his gun shot the military commissar Alexander Vladimirovich Elisiev. Making a statement after the incident, the head of the Irkutsk region stated that the person who carried out the armed attack was a 25-year-old man named Ruslan Zini. This confusion in Russia continues. The possibility of a new mobilization decision is also fueling the fire in Russia. The Kremlin, on the other hand, began to make some efforts to bring Kiev to a deal table on its own terms. Because if this war continues, it will continue until the Russian army is completely destroyed and Russia will lose its future more than today. In the last few months, Ukraine has succeeded in proving many of its critics wrong by launching a counteroffensive and reclaiming most of its territory from Russia. But Ukraine's military success and Russia's withdrawal were not enough to persuade Kiev's Western allies to increase support. Instead, there was some pressure on the Ukrainian government to engage with the Kremlin. In particular, US Chief of Staff Mark Milley pressed for diplomacy, insisting that Ukraine could not save the rest of its territory. Other members of President Joe Biden's administration did not publicly support his calls for talks, but Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky felt pressured to signal openness to the negotiations. As a Bosnian watching the events, I hear alarm bells ringing. I feel that Ukraine is heading towards the fate of Bosnia, a state rendered dysfunctional by a deeply flawed peace agreement. Of course, we cannot draw a full parallel between Ukraine and Bosnia and Herzegovina. When my country was attacked in 1992, the United Nations imposed an arms embargo that limited its ability to defend itself. It lost a lot of territory to the enemy and could not stop a genocide. The European Community and the UN, the predecessors of the European Union, sent diplomats who followed a policy of division in the language of peace. "Don't dream," British mediator David Owen told the Bosnians in a rare moment of sincerity as they hoped for Western military intervention. By contrast, Ukraine has enjoyed both diplomatic and military support since Russia's large-scale invasion. In particular, the supply of weapons allowed Kiev not only to thwart Russia's plans to fully invade the country, but also to launch a successful counterattack.